on the West Coast, so we are going to
It
let you
was
take it away
my
and
home state,
explain. Yeah.
where I was from, just like the words of Joan Didion. I'm Marisa Meltzer. I am a native Californian, but I live in New York, and I wrote this book, It Girl, about Jane Birkin. And usually I'd be in conversation with someone, but now I'm just going to be talking to you like Miss Nancy on Romper Room or whatever, but also way more time to take questions. So, sometimes I feel a little bit sheepish when people ask me about the genesis of this project, because it is a little bit ambulance chasery, if I'm being a bit honest. I found out that Jane Birkin died, and my editor suggested this could be a really good book for you. And she didn't even know really the extent of my sort of francophilia or anything like that. And I was born on Bastille Day, which is like the French version of the 4th of July. And my parents would often just throw me these sort of like half-ass default birthdays. It was like involved like a Les Mis theme or like a French cake. And so like the francophilia went in my bones very early. And so I was always into Paris and French people, but then also I was into movies and watched Blow Up, which Jane Birkin is in, at a very tender age, and was introduced to her music probably through like a boyfriend when I was like 18 or something like that. And so I knew enough about her to know kind of the broad strokes of Jane Birkin's life, that she sang, that she acted in some significant projects, and of course that she was the namesake for the Birkin bag. But I knew enough to know that there was probably like a whole lot more life and woman and person there than the sort of like flattening two-dimensional view that maybe we all had of her, particularly in the English-speaking world. She was like kind of a household name in France, but France isn't that big. And so for like a little backstory, she was born to kind of like an upper class-ish family in London. Her mom was a pretty famous stage actress who was a muse to Noel Coward, the playwright. And her dad was a spy and a military hero who had an eye patch. And she grew up in a big Victorian house in Chelsea, and was very unhappy, the kind of family where the kids go off to boarding school at like age 11 or 12, and she hated it. And she was in an all-girls school in the Isle of Wight, and would do very dramatic things to try to get dismissed or like kicked out of school, like eating rocks to be sent to the infirmary. And eventually her parents were just like, fine, you don't have to go to school anymore. And she went to Paris as kind of like a finishing school, and then went back to London when she was still a teenager to kind of find herself. And she ended up deciding to try to follow in the family footsteps and act. And that's kind of when she became like the it girl that the title suggests. She was in some plays. She was in a Cadbury commercial for a chocolate bar. She was in the movie The Knack. She was in Blow Up. And she also married John Barry, who was the composer for all the early James Bond films, and who was also like 31 when she was 17 when they started dating. And they got married, which her parents really opposed for all the reasons you might imagine. And it did not go well. He seemed to never really be faithful to her. And she thought, she wanted a baby. And I think she thought having a baby would help the marriage. And basically that crumbled, and she got a job and moved to Paris. And so this is all the preamble to sort of her life really beginning in Paris. And so what we have then is like a story of a woman who finds herself on the continent in Paris, as one does, and falls in love with like an ugly, sexy Frenchman who's one of the most famous people in the country, Serge Gainsbourg, who'd previously was fresh off a hot and heavy affair with Brigitte Bardot. And they had a kind of a love affair for the ages and became one of the sort of most publicly horny and collaborative couples in Europe and in the world. And this is the story of a woman who, is best known as kind of a sidekick and someone who inspires greatness and brings it out of other people, and trying to kind of think about her in a fully nuanced, three-dimensional way of, how she might want to be remembered, how we should try to remember her, and who she really was, and if she was so carefree, if she was so happy to be, you know, spoken of in the same breath along with the famous men that she dated and the bags. I can start just taking questions now. Yeah. Yeah.
Fashion magazines
Mhm.
revere her as a style icon, but anytime I've read interviews with her, she was less interested in that, it seemed. And I'm not even going to say that's superficial, but she was very much more wholesome. And can you talk a little bit about, was she comfortable with that label as this style icon, and what did she value?
I think no one who's a real style icon is comfortable with the label, just like no one who's a real it girl would ever call themselves an it girl. It's kind of like hoisted upon you. And if you really are that kind of person, it's sort of embarrassing. I do think that style was an area of agency and self-expression for her. And she just always had like an innate great sense of combining t-shirts and jeans with the right pair of, like high-heeled Mary Janes. So it looked like something sort of like her more than the sum of its parts. I also think, her red carpet looks so good because she's wearing maybe like a Yves Saint Laurent gown or something like that, but it's in conversation and looks, part of a whole of how she dressed day to day. So I think she was conversant and happy and like glad to be part of the world of fashion. Certainly didn't seem to turn down opportunities to be in fashion magazines. She was so famous in France in the 70s that she was on the cover of Vogue like multiple times a year. And so she participated in that. But if you go a step deeper and you read her diaries and interview people, you do see that I don't think that's where her like quotidian, daily concerns lie. I think she was much more interested in her creative life and her family and kind of self-actualization, for lack of a better sort of word. And you see how little she seemed to think about fashion, which is maybe part of the privilege of like being good at fashion and being good at dressing yourself, that it just kind of comes naturally. And also having, being friends with famous designers and having Paco Rabanne send you a dress. Like you're not thinking about it that much when you're 5'7" and like a size 0 and look incredible and everything. And people are sending you free clothes because it's easy. She could make a sailor shirt, look amazing or whatever. But I think that fashion was certainly key, but I think that the sort of way that she's remembered, the scales are off, right? Especially in America and Britain and kind of outside the French language world, because she really did act almost exclusively in French and in European movies. So, she's kind of remembered as this almost like nameless person on mood boards and, now and in reality, she was in a lot of films and she was the subject of 2 feature-length documentaries, and she was a lot more than that, which isn't to say that this book is just a sort of love letter to her. I think she was actually a like very complicated person who had a strange relationship with ambition and money and those sorts of things, but there's a lot to explore for sure. Should we just start taking questions? Is there anything else you guys want to hear about?
You mentioned her daughters.
Yeah.
I don't know her daughters.
Well, she pulled a real it girl move, which is that she gave birth to a few it girl daughters. So one of her daughters sadly died like a little over 10 years ago. And then the other two are Charlotte Gainsbourg and Lou Doyon, who are both in kind of creative industries living in France. And Charlotte Gainsbourg is pretty famous as an actress and a singer and models. And Lou Doyon is, I think, more of a singer and a model. But they've both been kind of multi hyphenates and were famous from birth. Charlotte in particular got like the César Award, which is like the French Oscar for Best Newcomer when she was 13 or 14 years old or something like that. And, was the kind of person that was made tabloid headlines just for being born. So she's been really in the public eye her whole life. And Charlotte is maybe like 55, 53 now. And Lou is in her probably like early 40s. Yeah. She had kids pretty spread apart. She had a daughter in like 1967 and one in like 72 or 73 and then one in 1984. So pretty spread apart. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you talk about some of your research?
Yeah. I mean, it was a total delight because I thought, okay, I should probably go to Paris for research. Yeah, right. Twist my arm. Yeah. And at first I thought I would go for, 2 weeks or something like that. And then right around the time that I was starting to kind of schedule it out, I found out that the apartment that I was living in New York the building was being sold and I was going to have to find a new apartment to live in. And, I'm sure you all are very familiar with like the hell of finding places to live in any city. And so I just put it off and put all of my stuff in storage and took my dog and 2 suitcases to Paris for a few months and then found an apartment when I got back. But it gave me a lot of time to be in Paris, which I'm glad because I needed it because there was so much. I mean, there were tons of magazine archives like of Elle and Vogue and Marie Claire and like on and on and on. And there were people to interview and there was her grave to visit and her favorite restaurants and her home and just all of the, like media, like, songs and movies that are easier to come by there. And yeah, I mean, every book kind of has a strange thing where, when you hear about someone saying that they worked on a book for like 10 or 15 years, you can see why, because you could just keep researching and going on and on and on forever. And at a certain point, you have to just kind of tell yourself, like, this is when it ends, unless some crazy thing comes through, or I'll never start writing it. So Paris was kind of good because I just decided I had to stop when I left and start focusing on writing it and getting it all down. But the research is always my favorite part of any writing project. And this one was just, again, a total delight. It was over late fall and winter and, the holidays and snow and, walking. Like there were just points when I was walking my dog along the Seine wearing a beret and like carrying a baguette and being like, wow, am I really this person right now? But it was it was really like a high point in my career. Yeah. And I hope all of that like immersion really shows in the book. Yeah.
How did you really feel about the Birkin bag and the fact that this bag was named after her that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars? Did you think anything about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I've thought about a lot. I was actually at the auction over the summer when the bag went for 10.1 million. So I was very much in the room and covering the experience. I think that she had a pretty healthy relationship with it. Part of that was sort of the bad side and that she didn't make money off of it. It was that kind of classic sort of old school muse situation where you're just honored to have something named after you. And she got the bags for free. And, she was a friend of the house, as they say in the fashion world. And, but on the other hand, I think that lack of kind of like economic incentive or whatever, like business arrangement, allowed her to feel like the bag was not her identity, and she was able to feel kind of divorced from the bag in a healthy way. Like everyone else is so obsessed with the Birkin, and everyone else has kind of projected onto the Birkin bag this symbol of like making it and like the ultimate and all of these things. And I think, for her, it was barely an anecdote in her life. It wasn't something that she wrote about in her diaries. It was something that she really only talked about in interviews because everyone asked, but it wasn't something that I think was super important to her. She wasn't ashamed of it, and I think she even celebrated it, but she, it wasn't her identity. And I think that probably is the healthiest relationship that anyone has to a Birkin bag. So, she could have, if you look at like Michael Jordan, the Air Jordan came out, I think, the exact same time as the Birkin bag, and look at the billions of dollars that he and his family has made off of it. But that was gone into in a completely different manner and negotiated, and using his likeness and his whole identity to like market and sell it. And she didn't really do any of that. So she was kind of got to have the Birkin without having to do anything for it and kind of just be herself. So I don't know. I think it's a bit of a Rorschach test, and I will be interested as people read the book to think, what readers take away on whether or not whether she was robbed of money that she should have been owed, or whether it seemed like a relief not to have to promote the Birkin and be the face of the Birkin, or whether it's just sad or surreal when your name is kind of taken away from you when it's so much more famous than you will ever be. Any other questions? Yeah.
I would say it's interesting. I want to actually hear about you. How many books have you written, and how do you motivate yourself to write when you don't even want to get out of bed?
This is my 5th book. I'm like this sounds so weird, but I do have a sort of machine-like quality where I'm just very good at like plugging myself in and like focusing and just doing it. And I think part of that is because I've basically been a professional writer my entire life. And so even though I love it, it's also like muscle memory. Like it's not like if I had to run a mile right now, it would be like the hardest thing in the world because I hate cardio and resist it. But like I write all the time. And so it's not like I just know how to and when you're writing a book, especially in a big project, it's like a subject that you're taking years to do. And so even when you're not thinking about it, you're thinking about it. Like you're dreaming about it. You're having like little insights in the middle of a shower. And even when you're not sort of cognizant that you're thinking about it, it's all kind of like in your head. And so, for years. So it's also not like I'm having to be like, what am I writing about again? What did that person say? Like it's all so inside of me that to me, it's not, writer's block is never a challenge. It's more like finding when you're writing a book, especially like a biography, it's finding the right subject where it's like, has someone written about them before? Have they written about themselves before? Do enough people know about them? Do too many people know about them? Like, it's that like kind of right person. Like, does it make sense for me to write about them? Last night I did an event and I was joking that like I'm exclusively announcing that I'm doing a Diane Keaton like biography right now, which is a little bit dark, and I'm not, someone else should do that. But like, there is a little bit of like that, just finding the right subject that's like a match for you. And I also always think it has to kind of be like a deeply kind of nerdy interest, because you're spending so much time on, this person or this company or whatever the story is. And if it's not something that's always kind of interesting to you, then it'll just feel like the worst kind of slog. And yeah, I mean, I think that it's my job. So I'm always interested in like, what to do with myself. And also, I think that I want to relax and do nothing, but I'm really bad at that. Like I need kind of like a big picture project, or all of my like, or I'll just think about nuclear war all the time or something like that. Like I just am like person that needs to have my mind kind of like something to always kind of fall back on. Otherwise I get really neurotic. So I like a big project, and I love, I mean, it sounds unfortunately sincere, but like I grew up a huge reader. I was both voted best reader in 1987 at the Galt School in Santa Cruz, California, and I think that they chose right. Sadly, or no, it was 1988. The year before, I was voted best personality and somehow lost out the next year to best reader. But I really did, I made something of myself, and I love reading and I love writing, and like, I read books all the time, and I love writing books. I like to kind of contribute and be a part of that world because it's my favorite. And so, it's something I feel very like committed to and privileged to be part of. Yeah.
I have a question kind of along that vein. I feel like when I read different books kind of at the same time, I feel like they're in conversation together. And so as you were writing this book, do you remember what you were reading and how that may or may not have influenced this? Or you can kind of speak to that.
Yeah, it's a good question. Sometimes I can't read nonfiction when I'm writing nonfiction, because I remember once when I was writing my last book, Glossy, I started reading literally like 5 pages of Empire of Pain, the Sackler book, and it was so well written and reported that I was like, I can't measure up. This is so, and then I was like, you can't do this. Like, this is not, you can't be writing your own nonfiction book about like a company and reading something that's even vaguely similar. So I tend to read a ton of like romance novels and mysteries and genre books. I have a book club seminar that my friend Jonathan, who's also in it, and we tend to read more like we did Lolita. We tend to read classics, most of which we have good relationships, but we did read Dr. Zhivago in January, and that was hard on many of us. So yeah, I'll read classics. I read a lot of fiction. I'll read some things like I tend to review books, and they're pretty much always nonfiction. And so I was reading, there's a biography that I reviewed of Gala Dali, Salvador Dali's wife, who, similarly was celebrated in a different generation, but as a muse to the Dadaists and Surrealists. And there were certain things about just the writing, the structure of that book where like, I was struggling in a draft of this book where my editor kept trying to cut out party scenes. And I was like, does she hate fun? Like, why do I love famous people and parties popping up in the book. And she was kept trying to explain to me that there were so many parties that they needed to be distinguished, or, I needed to kind of pick and choose. And then I read the Gala Dali book, which I really loved, but it had so many party scenes. And I was like, I got it. Like, they knew famous people. They went to fabulous parties that are legendary every single night. Like, why is this night different from all other nights? And that's when I realized that I had to that's what I needed to adopt in this book. I needed to like show why certain nights out or parties that I was talking about were, you know, important to like what was going on in her life or meeting someone. It wasn't just enough that she was, you know, there were plenty of things that got cut out that I just thought were hilarious and delightful. Like she went to like a Bruce Springsteen concert in Paris with one of Grace Kelly's sons, like one of the Grimaldi princes. And I think maybe like Bob Dylan was with them, or somehow like they ran into him and they were just all so French of like, oh, Bruce Springsteen, he's so American, like he's so authentic. And like I thought that was hilarious, but it didn't even make a draft of the book because it's like, you know, we don't really need that, and some things are fun for an anecdote, but her whole life was like that. Like, you know, even when she was a teenager, there's like an entry in her diary in maybe like 1964, 65 that's like lunch with Jay Leno, very nice, you know, and she was friends with all the Beatles, and that was her brother worked with them as a assistant director and cinematographer on some of their films. So it was all, that was her life from childhood. You know, one of her childhood friends was like Hayley Mills, the famous, you know, British Disney actress. So that was kind of always how things were for her. And I wanted to show that without making it sort of like repetitive or boring or just a slew of names, like a, you know, party report. Yeah.
And what was her relationship to her fame? Did she, I mean, enjoy it? Did she ever think it was too much? I mean,
I think she enjoyed it. I think the parts that got on her nerves were when she would be older and people would just want her to talk about being 20 years old and she was like 70 years old, or they'd want her to sign naked photos of herself when she was very young. And it's sort of like, oh, I'm suspended as this like, you know, sort of gamine, yeah, it girl ingenue for my whole life, you know. And I think the bag also was like, people were like, are you related to the bag? And even though I think she had a very good humor about all that stuff, I imagine it gets really annoying. But I also think she was in Paris. In Paris, kind of like New York, is a city that you can be famous and also live like kind of a normal life. Like people won't bother you. And you can, you know, she went to cafes and bakeries and farmers markets and just like everyone else, and was sort of like a member of the neighborhood. And people saw her, and I think people would stop or take her picture, but it seems like it was not a bad level of fame. I mean, I think there were moments like when she and Serge Gainsbourg broke up where it's like tabloid stuff, but even then she'd find out that like he would call the tabloids and stuff. So, you know, I think living in France allowed her a nice kind of, yeah, balance of living. Yeah.
How is aging for her? So if everyone wants to think of her as like a 20-year-old it girl, can you be a 70-year-old it girl? How does that play out?
There's a lot in the book about that. And she was like pretty brutally honest about aging. You know, we're living in such an interesting time to have that conversation because celebrities keep showing up with like new faces, and plastic surgery is becoming more and more the norm and the standard. And she didn't do that. She got a teeny tiny bit of Botox, I think, but like, you know, didn't have a facelift and had the face of someone who had spent a lot of time in the sun and had once smoked 3 packs a day and lived, you know. And part of that might have been that she had a very long struggle with cancer. And so maybe plastic surgery is not what you're going to do while you're in, you know, chemotherapy or whatever. But also, you know, as I get older, I see people that are my exact age saving up or booking various, you know, increasingly invasive treatments. And it's always kind of a question of like, oh, maybe I should get this done, or like maybe I would, but then every day you like don't until you do, or until you die. And in some ways, I think that's just how it was with her, where it was like a consideration and a joke. And she, you know, made kind of jokes at her own expense that she could just cover up the mirrors. And I think it's hard, especially when, you know, I'm a writer and my life has not been predicated on being like the hottest person in Europe and looking great in like, you know, mini skirts and thigh high boots and stuff like that. But hers was. So to have wrinkles and to have gained weight and have your face change, that's got to be particularly hard, extra hard. But she chose not to. And I think that's another part of the book that I'll be interested to hear how that kind of sits with people in this hot bed of, you know, cosmetic surgery, deep plane facelifts that we're all going through, you know.
Well, that's inspiring.
I think so too. I don't think it was this big like feminist statement for her that I can tell, but again, she didn't, you know. And I think it's more just that we all deserve to see an array of people aging the way that we would deserve to see an array of different bodies and faces, but different ways of aging in public. And in Europe, you definitely, I think, get more diversity of that, like in terms of who's famous and the way that they look in the public eye. And so that could also have helped that she was just in a culture where it's a little bit more okay to be 70 and not, you know, like look like you're permanently in a wind tunnel, or like that you and your daughter could be the same age or whatever, you know. But yeah, any other questions? Yeah.
I feel like writing a biography of someone must be such an intimate act where you're recreating their whole life and really inhabiting their headspace. So I'm wondering, while doing that, is there anything from Jane Birkin that you like really absorbed into your daily life and your personality that you wanted to emulate, or is there anything that you were like, oh, I really want to leave this on the page?
Yeah, in some ways it was the same thing. I think that I have a tendency to be very controlled in my life, particularly in my romantic relationships. And I think a lot of women feel this way, where it's like the worst thing that a man can call you is like crazy. And I always want to be the person that's like, looks like I'm taking the high road, or like can't be bothered, or like I'm not going to text you 3 times and that sort of thing. And meanwhile, I'm writing about someone who is like jumping into the Seine to make a point and like having like screaming fights in front of nightclubs and in public, and feeling loved and worthy of loved, and also like that was just who she was, and that was how kind of everyone around her was acting. In some ways, it's a bit immature and childish and very dramatic and probably very annoying to be around. And I don't want to be that person, but I also think a little bit of that was good for me, just to remember that in any part of my life that like it was okay if I throw a holiday party and like everyone knows that I was drunk at, you know, it's like, oh, caught me, you know, like I got drunk at my own Christmas party, wild, you know, but like there's part of me that gets like a little mortified by those slips in composure. And so I think bringing a little bit of that like 70s European, just Europeanness, like big feelings, big emotions, just being big was really inspiring. But also there were moments where I was like, there are ways in which I want to be when I want to feel things, and ways in which I don't. But it was something I thought about all the time while I was working on the book. Yeah.
I'm curious how protective you start to feel of the subject, and if you unearth something that's not flattering, and even as a writer, you can't position it. I'm a journalist too,
Yeah.
and I've interviewed people, and someone has said something, and I thought, oh, I wish you hadn't said that, and I can't include this because even though it's clickbait, you didn't mean it that way, or whatever. Have you ever unearthed anything about a subject that you felt like you wouldn't include?
I think I'm going to sound like a sociopath, but
You're gonna sound like Joe Didion.
But no, I would include it. I mean, I think I'm a good journalist, and that I'm not including anything that isn't on the record, sourced, backed up. I would never intentionally take something and put it in like a context that I know to be wrong. But no, and like for writing a biography, we're all flawed, right? And we all make mistakes. And I love books where you can show a person as being fully human and making choices that you wouldn't always support. And so it's not like I'm looking to make anyone look bad or anything, but I also I feel a lot of fondness for her, for Jane Birkin, but I'm not her daughter. I don't, I'm here to tell the story of her life. And obviously I am rooting for her. I have affection for who she is. I think she's important, but I'm more than happy, I think, to show, unflattering things, I think, for any of my subjects. And, I've had pushback from people when I wanted to interview them saying like, I've read other things, like, are you going to make me look bad? And it's like, I don't know. I mean, I'm certainly, I always say like, I'm not a mean-spirited person. I never go into anything trying to make anyone look bad. And I don't think I've ever made anyone look wholly bad, but like, I do think that I want people to seem real. Yeah.
I'm just kind of curious, going off a little bit of what you were talking about. With Glossy, yes, Emily Weiss was like a big part of that, but it was more like about the company itself. And I wonder what's the difference between writing about that and writing about a straightforward biography.
I mean, in some ways they're similar, but different in terms of the way that you're telling the story. Like, for example, with Glossier, I lived in the same city. I was the same age, more or less. I knew a lot of the people, not necessarily as friends, but I had interviewed them many times. I knew about the company from its earliest days. So I was like there and been there and had years of reporting and was kind of, boots on the ground in a way. And this Birkin book was different. Like, I didn't know Jane Birkin. I never met her. And this was more drawn upon interviewing people and also just the great amount of archival research of, her past. And that's a really different way of viewing someone. But for example, with Jane Birkin, we have her diaries. So there was a lot of in the moment emotional writing about how she felt about certain things. And I certainly didn't have that about Emily Weiss for Glossier. And, it's like there's a new-ish Mark Twain book. People write about people that they never knew, that have been long gone all the time. And there's different ways of kind of telling people's stories. And I think each person telling the story of someone else is going to come up with a slightly different version. There's always a point in writing where I kind of lose my mind and start having these what is truth? Who tells their own best story? Do I know the truth of my own life? I start kind of spiraling out. And that's when I know it's okay, you're really in it. You need to take a deep breath and just get through the next chapter. But those are big questions that I think every biography or nonfiction book tries to answer. Yeah.
Maybe this is obvious, but so how does it work with the diaries? Were they published? I don't know.
They were published in French.
Okay.
I speak French, so I was able to read them and then kind of translate them and put them in. And there were certain things that I was able to there's just a lot of archives in France, state archives. So there was all kinds of TV interviews and stuff that were sort of only available, or private archives where someone was collecting certain kinds of fashion or whatever to see clothes she was wearing or whatever. And then there were all sorts of other things of just even watching movies from the era that she wasn't in but informed that time. So there's just like a lot of different layers of research.
So you didn't have to get permission to use the diaries or?
No, I would have had to have permission to reprint a certain amount of them. So, but that's all part of the publishing process of like deciding how much you can quote and use and how much you're analyzing it and writing about it. Anything else?
I
Yeah.
was just gonna go off of her last question, and and you mentioned it early in your preamble about sort of the more complicated.
Preamble is a nice word for it. I hope it wasn't too boring.
No, it's great. It was great. I needed it because I haven't read the book yet.
Yeah. No one has. It just came out. Yeah.
So, what were some? You mentioned finances. Some of those more complex, darker parts of her personality, or.
I think she made some decisions that I personally would not have made, and I think don't age well in terms of motherhood and her daughters, especially the way that we see childhood now, as opposed to like the early 70s, where she was like, I want to go out and I want to be close to my daughter. So I will go out with my daughter physically in a basket by my side. There's another time when she throws another one of her daughters a 12th birthday party at a nightclub at midnight so they can all dance, and it's like, I can see how those decisions were made. And I think a lot of it was a reaction to her own sort of parents, slightly colder, like Edwardian parenting style, where it's like you have nannies and you go to boarding school. And even though her family was close, it was not that same, like, I'm cooking for you and I'm there by your side and I'm picking you up from school. And so I think she wanted that, but it was kind of, she's born the first year with the baby boomers. So I think it was that thing. She's close in age to my own parents, and of wanting to have it all. And that meant not sacrificing anything. But of course, that doesn't, work. And so I think that there are many different incidents where she allowed her daughters or her partners to make decisions that either, I think, probably made her really unhappy or weren't great parenting decisions. But then also like things about her career or ambition. But I think she was not motivated by money or by ambition. I think she was very interested in like love and relationships and pursuing her own version of artistic greatness.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. If anyone else?
I mean, this has been a long Q&A, so if you guys are questioned out, I will very much understand. Yeah.
I'd love to know more about the interview process for this book. Did you get any pushback? What kind of like conversations you had? What was the most insightful or rewarding conversation?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely pushback when you want to write a story about someone who died recently. There's definitely some comments or here and there from representatives or people that like it's too soon, which I understand, but I also I like respect the work that I wanted to do and the story that I wanted to tell, so that doesn't deter me. I think also I'm kind of a nobody in France, which is not, I'm not trying to put myself down, but it's like, journalism it literally doesn't translate. So it's like, I might write for places that are well known in America and be able to say like, I write for the New York Times, or like, I wrote this book about this person, and it just doesn't mean the same thing there. And so it's sort of like, what reason should we have to talk to you? Why does America need its own biography of Jane Birkin? Like, we have her, she belongs to us. And so I think there's a bit of that. But also there are plenty of people that are very willing to talk, and I was talking to everyone from people that other journalists who had interviewed her before, or people who worked with her professionally, or people who were neighbors, or even just like Juliette Binoche, who knew her socially as like a fellow actress. So I take kind of like a, leave no stone unturned kind of thing. Everyone that you talk to will often have someone else that you should try, and you can't make anyone talk to you that's not going to. So it's just a lot of like casting a really wide net and being assertive. Like, I'll remind people that the project is still happening and if they change their mind, but I'm also not, I never want to pop up in someone's inbox and have someone be like, oh, not you again, happens to all of us and it gets annoying. But yeah, but I think, something like some of the celebrities were fun to talk to, like Juliette Binoche talking about how she felt, Jane Birkin's frailty, like the last time she saw her on the red carpet, and then found out that she had a stroke and that, no one really knew that, things like that feel very intimate are interesting. And things like just like talking to Dakota Johnson, who had played a version of a character that Jane Birkin had played in A Bigger Splash, which was kind of a remake of La Piscine, which is a great movie that Jane Birkin was in. And she was like, I owe my bangs to Jane Birkin. Like, so it's kind of like all, you can have things that are like quite vulnerable and sad and things that are like a bit light that resonate with you. And I guess it helps when it's like someone very famous telling you that like you remember, but yeah. Thank you guys so much for being such a great audience for this solo expedition.
For taking the time and for easily holding your own.
Oh.
We have a few more copies if you haven't gotten one, and I'm sure she will sign your copies. Some
Anything
of them
at
she
all.
already did, but if you'd like her
I can
to
personalize,
them, obviously. Thank you so much.
Of course. Should I take this off? Yeah.
I'll take it.